Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm that's focused on helping to address the complex development challenges we have on the continent. As you know, Africa is home to about 1.5 billion people and some of the most dynamic economies. Yet many of these nations have stalled reforms, weak institutions, uneven development. What bold strategies or strategic choices must the continent make to build stronger economies and improve the lives of our people? My guest today understands these issues and has written extensively and spoken extensively about pragmatic solutions to these challenges. For the last 30 years or so, he's worked as a development leader in more than 40 countries. He has unparalleled experience in building financial systems that deliver impact and has a deep understanding of Africa, as well as unmatched connections at the heart of international financial systems. He's currently a vice president on special leave for budget, performance review, and strategic planning at the World Bank. Previously, he served as chief of staff to two World Bank presidents, David Malpass and Ajay Banga, as well as senior advisor to two World Bank CFOs. He also served as the director for International Development Association, IDA, Resource Mobilization, and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, Corporate Finance Department, where he was responsible for implementing IDA's hybrid financial model and the policy analysis of IBRD, income and corporate finance. In this role, he oversaw a really successful IDA 20 replenishment 1 year earlier than planned, with a record $93 billion raised to finance 75 of the world's poorest country. About half of them are in Africa. He's also authored several seminal books serving as foundational thoughts for Africa finance, making finance work for Africa. I mean, it's a must read for people in the space. He's also co-authored two World Bank publications, Financing Africa Through the Crisis and Beyond, and Financial Sector Development in Africa, Opportunities and Challenges. Dr. Maimbo, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your generous introduction. Greatly appreciated. And congratulations for this program. It's programs like this that get us talking about Africa. So thank you very much.
And thank you for making time to join us. We've been seeing your movements across Africa, campaigning for the presidency of the Africa Development Bank. So we're really appreciative that you could find the time to do this with us. But I thought we could start by unpacking your thoughts on Africa's development, its challenges, its potential, the role for the Africa Development Bank in all of this. And, ultimately, why do you consider yourself the best person to lead us at this pivotal time, when Africa must get its act together and address the very pressing needs we have? So if I may start, you've dedicated your very dynamic career to addressing Africa's development challenges. You're well acquainted, with the various scholars and their theories regarding Africa's underdevelopment. From your perspective, why have we continued to struggle as a continent with developing and ensuring quality of life for our people?
Thank you very much. That's a great point to start this conversation. But before we get into it, I want to make sure we don't lose sight of what's working on the continent. Across the continent is actually higher than the global average.
Okay.
We have 16 countries today that are growing at a rate of more than 6% per annum. We have 300 firms with revenues in excess of $1 billion. And the level of innovation in our financial systems is as good as it is anywhere in the world. Our technological advancements in mobile telephony are great. But your point is valid. Why are we still struggling? And after 30 years in development, I come down to one issue, and that the pace and scale of our development efforts simply is not enough. You can go from Cape to Cairo, from Nairobi to Abidjan. You will find good development projects, good development initiatives. But unfortunately, they continue to pale in comparison to the scale of our challenge, which is what brings me to the African Development Bank, which is after working in development and getting global experience, watching all of these developments take place, I've come to the conclusion that the formula for development that saw Europe develop, America develop, Asia develop is exactly the same that we need right here on the continent, which is massive investment and scale. And if there is one thing that I hope a successful Maimbo presidency will leave behind is significantly higher resources for governments, for individual projects, so that we continue to make a lasting impact on our people.
And that's a fantastic understanding of what the issues are and how we move forward. But if I may dig deeper, where do you see the growth, the massive growth opportunities in Africa? And I know I run a risk of kind of generalizing Africa. We know it's not a country, it's a continent, different people at different levels of development. But as you travel across the continent, as you've engaged with these issues over the last 3 decades, where do you see the significant growth opportunities on the continent?
No, thank you for that question. Over the last 3 months, I've traveled to well over 30 countries, and the diversity that you've just acknowledged is alive and well on the continent. And I think when it comes to growth, which is key to getting us out of the quagmire that we find ourselves in, I am encouraged by the fact that we've got many sources of growth. If we look at our traditional industries, mining, agriculture, the key there is reinvesting and making sure that we're getting as much value as possible, as close to our sources of production as possible. We need to add more value to our products. To the latest and sort of the newer industries, whether it is film, whether it is the arts, I have met amazing young people on the continent whose work, if you put it in a gallery in New York, in London, in Paris, would command significantly higher dollar values than they currently are. And so when I look at the sources of growth, I'm not worried about identifying new sources of growth. It's about how do we pull all of these things together to make sure that they're actually working for Africa. And in this regard, there are 3 pillars or 3 areas of focus that I want to champion. The first one is getting us to trade with one another. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to be the biggest source of growth on the continent for the simple reason that as long as we continue an export-led growth model, our products are going to be much more expensive than than other global products. It's for that reason that when people talk about Africa's contribution to global trade, it's been at 3% for the last 10 years. It was probably 4% when you go back to the 1980s. It was about 5%, in the 1960s, 70s. And if we keep doing what we're doing today, by 2030, 2050, we're only about 2.7%. So we've got to accelerate continental trade because it's cheaper, it expands our markets, and it will attract additional investment. But as we pursue that, we mustn't lose sight of the basics of development. If you're going to trade with one another, you're going to have infrastructure between you, your countries. You're going to have to invest in energy, and you're going to have to invest in human capital to make sure that the engine of growth is growing. And I think if we are, there's plenty of debates as to why we are not doing that at the moment. I come to the conclusion that I look forward to debating with staff at the African Development Bank is, are we investing too much in individual country projects? So that if you add up all the money we're pouring into infrastructure on the continent, add up all the money we're pouring into energy, it is significant. It's just that we're not investing it in a way that connects these economies and gets them to thrive rather than just survive.
And we themed this conversation cracking the code, and I think we've gotten to that point now because you've kind of identified for us what we believe are the big levers, right? Trade, investment in infrastructure, investment in human capital. Now, if you can dig a bit deeper into that, what's challenged us with having this intercontinental trade? What are the political challenges? What are the infrastructure challenges? And how do you see the Africa Development Bank, playing a pivotal catalytic role in resolving these issues and just driving us in that direction where we can see more trading and the growth that comes from that?
So in answering that question, I must start by acknowledging the fact that I don't have a silver bullet to this particular problem. Otherwise, it would have been done. But what I do come with is the experience and knowledge that development is not a linear process.
Mm-hmm.
That development is people just like you and me debating solutions and putting our best foot forward, learning and constantly improving. So if there's one thing that I want to do more at the African Development Bank is actually spend time debating issues, listening to our governments, listening to the private sector, especially the domestic private sector in each one of these countries who have been at this for quite some time. Mm-hmm. That said, there are a couple of things which have been consistently provided to me alongside this campaign trail. The first one is financing. We need to increase the amount of financing that governments are dealing with. And for some governments, it means finishing the outstanding work on debt that they're grappling with. You can't grow if your arm is tied behind your back. Exactly. For some governments, it means doubling down on domestic resource mobilization and making sure that we are reinvesting in our economies. And for those African countries that are growing, have good, decent macro situations, it's about increasing access to international markets. So that diversity of financing sources is going to be critical. Now, as an institution, we can't join that conversation as effectively as we should if we remain an $8 billion annual lending institution. $8 billion is significant, but it's nowhere near enough for a continent with 1.5 billion people with a development agenda that we have. So a significant part of the work that we need to do is to make sure that we are strengthening the financial foundations of the African Development Bank, diversifying its sources of finance. And I have a high degree of respect for the finance team that's at the African Development Bank. A lot of innovation there. I look forward to joining them, to supporting their work and scaling up the level of ambition. So financing is really critical. There is a second topic that goes with financing, and that's scaling up the voice of African governments on the global stage. I want to work with the African Union. I want to work with African heads of state to make sure that we are constantly amplifying Africa's voice on some of the topical issues today that are challenging, whether it is the changing model of development that has seen a reduction in concessional finance, whether it is the increase in tariff discussions that are redefining global trade as we speak, whether it is the issues on climate where there is a huge debate on what adaptation means and mitigation, making sure that my relatives in rural parts of Zambia who've never seen electricity in their homes, make sure that we are focusing on access as much. So there are all of these topical issues that make development messy, make development challenging. And we need to make sure that as we're increasing financing for our initiatives that are working, we are amplifying Africa's voice and we are defining African solutions for the many challenges we have on the continent.
I mean, you've opened up just too many routes I want to explore with you, and
now I'm going to get myself into trouble now.
But so you talked about the $8 billion, and I'm really interested in how you would address the AfDB's donor disengagement risks, particularly in light of the proposed $500 million or so US funding cuts. Assume that I'm part of this large African masses who have a significant trust deficit with anybody in a suit and tie. Explain to me something in your experience, that gives us the comfort that if you're the president of the African Development Bank, that you can address these risks, which are, clear and present.
So it's a really important question because it's a live and ongoing discussion at the moment. I think the starting point is acknowledging that the African Development Bank is a bank. It's a financial institution that draws in financing, both market priced and concessional financing, uses its balance sheet to on-lend to governments in order to support our people. That basic formula is the same for any financial institution. At the center of that formula are the strategic relationships that you have with your shareholders, both those that are on the continent and those that are outside the continent. And keeping in mind that as you run this institution, those shareholders have their own constituents, they have their own priorities. So at all times, the strategic engagement with your shareholders is going to be primary. And I've been in development long enough to fully understand that those shareholder interests will vary from time to time. So I never look at one particular decision as defining the future of that relationship. That relationship will remain as strong because I have no doubt that all of the shareholders in the African Development Bank are interested in seeing Africa develop. Their domestic interests will vary. And this is where, regardless of the decisions that are currently being made, my focus will remain the same. One, a strategic partnership. I will meet our shareholders where they are to understand what their priorities are, how they are changing to maintain that alignment. The second thing I will also make sure is that when it comes to a financial relationship with your shareholder, very rarely is it just about the money. Oftentimes, it's about what they're getting out of that money, what their aspirations are for that institution, how confident they are that every dollar that you put into the institution reflects good outcomes for the people that you're intending to serve, that the efficiency and effectiveness with which you're going to use that dollar is still going to be top-notch. Otherwise, they'll pursue the same interest with other institutions that might have more efficiencies and effectiveness. And so to answer your question more directly, of course, the recent decision is significant. It's a significant amount of the replenishment that goes into the African Development Fund. But I am very mindful that as this decision has come, it's a wake-up call for all of us within the institution that we need to significantly diversify the sources of financing for this bank. We need to make sure that as whatever financing we get, we're channeling it through the institution as effectively, as efficiently as we can so that we can continue to earn the confidence of all shareholders. But fundamentally, it also reminds us that we're not going to develop Africa purely on development aid. Africa will be developed by private sector financing. It will be developed by our own domestic savings on the continent. And that's the path. Aid can help, and it certainly does help governments survive. I came from Zambia, and Lord knows that aid has helped save lives. But in order to thrive, it is long overdue for us to replace the cycle of aid and debt to one of prosperity and growth and reinvestment and private sector path. It's a difficult path, but it is the only path that guarantees us sustainable growth in the years to come.
And I will definitely get to that point because it ties back to what you said about voice, and it ties back to agency and our role as human beings in determining our future, But I wanted to dwell a little bit on the operational efficiency of the AfDB. Many of the things that you've spoken about, you would have to drive through the machinery of the AfDB. As impactful as it has been, some of us who've watched it from outside see that the plumbing needs a bit of work. So what, in your experience, probably at the bank or somewhere else, Pricewaterhouse, or maybe at other places you've worked, can demonstrate to us that you have the ability, the experience to fix that internal plumbing to ensure that the AfDB can play the strategic role it needs to play to catalyze growth in Africa?
I'd like to stress, before we talk about my contribution, that what the African Development Bank is facing is not unique to the African Development Bank. This happens from time to time between all MDBs. The World Bank Group has just gone through and is still going through a process of reform of its own plumbing to make it as efficient as it possibly can. And other MDBs go through this cycle. These are large bureaucracies with people coming in and going out, and with time, we are very good at adding new layers in the spirit of making sure we're being equitable and inclusive. We're not as good at going back to those rules and checking whether we still need all of them. And I think the timing of a transition of one president to the other, regardless of who those individuals are, is always a good opportunity to ask basic questions. Do we need this step? Do we need this process? And to speak to my own experience, this is something that I've always done whenever I have taken on a large team. My current team at the World Bank is 600 people. 500 of them, I've had 30-minute conversations with each one of them asking 3 basic questions. What's working for you? What's not working for you? And what do you want me to focus on? And I guarantee that by the time you've gone through half of those conversations, you will come back to the same issues. And on this campaign trail in the last 9 months, when I've met with government officials, I've met with the private sector, I've met with staff of the African Development Bank, I've met with staff of other MDBs who work with the African Development Bank. I've simply asked the same questions, and we come down to the same set of issues that don't surprise me, the same set of issues that I've worked on before, which is one, when you look at the portfolio, when you look at a task team leader who has just finished a conversation with the government, who has to take that idea to board approval, what are the steps they're taking, they have to go through? The second area is budgeting. Budgeting is an important, you are in this industry, you know. Budgets can either hold back an institution because it takes over what you really want to do, or you can reform it in a way that it empowers quicker decision making. And a third layer, which is just as important, is the staffing and career path of the staff within the institution. These 3 basic elements of a good financial institution are present at the African Development Bank, they're present at the World Bank, and all the other MDBs. And over the last 5 years that I've gone through each of the positions that you mentioned in your generous introduction, these have been issues we have debated with, we've grappled with. There is never a best case scenario, but you must be willing to have these conversations. And allow me to say that the challenges at the African Development Bank, we often forget the history of the institution and what it has gone through. It successfully worked out of Tunis for 10 years. Moving from your headquarters to a different headquarters, moving back, and then subsequently making the decision, which was the right one, that we need to work closer to our clients, implementing a decentralization model, means that by definition, you have been changing systems and processes for some time. And what I'm looking forward to is joining the staff there, the leadership there, in completing that work so that by the time we're done, we had become known that this is an institution you want to deal with because they're quick. They may not always say yes to what you ask for, but the evaluation and the response will be quick. It's much easier to tell someone in the private sector, on this occasion, we can't help you after a month, than keeping them along for 18 months and then telling them we can only do half the deal. So that's what I'm focused on. Going back to basics with managing a financial institution that is aggregating significantly larger resources of financing, working within the institution. I was a task team leader for many years, supporting them in accelerating the pace of decision-making and making sure that the entire architecture, whether it be budgeting, staffing, portfolio allocation, is working as efficiently, as effectively as we need it to work at the African Development Bank.
Interesting. And I'm loving what I'm hearing. But I still have a few more questions about the AfDB and where it is.
Sure.
How would you address the AfDB's collapsing net interest margin, which has really fallen from like 93, I think it's about 93 or 93.5% in 2022 to 2023. And how do you do this to stabilize the revenue base? Yeah. What financial innovations will you employ to tackle the AfDB's revenue erosion and safeguard its AAA rating, which is critical for us. And again, what in your experience demonstrates to us and gives us the confidence that you're able to achieve this really important task?
So given that I know the staff that are in the finance complex, I know that this is something that they're dealing with aggressively. And I know I look forward to joining them, because for any institution, and this goes back to one of the reasons that I fell in love with finance, is that if you monitor your financial situation on an ongoing basis, and for a bank, you should be doing it with your daily balance sheet, you know where you are about to catch a cold, you know which areas of your business need surgery. And so what you describe is something that is important to look at, because part of that may be a result of the global financial situation that we've gone to with the changing interest rates globally. It may be something specific to the MDB industry as a whole, as we rightly pointed out earlier. It also may be specific to the institution itself. But one thing that I expect our conversations will include will be, one, a discussion about our cost base as an institution and how much is it costing us for every loan, for every operation that we're taking. It will require us to look at the portfolio and the portfolio mix and to see which products may not be generating the revenue we need to be fiscally sustainable. There are many products which you don't expect revenue, given that we work in all sorts of markets. I certainly don't want us to be overpricing our work in fragile states, but we must always have a portfolio that generates adequate revenue for us to cover our cost base. The third area is then also to look objectively at different sources of revenue and financing. We've got a large balance sheet that is involved in all sorts of businesses. We need to find ways in which we can partner with financial institutions to make sure that that marginal revenue is important. And I think in development, far too often we feel guilty having this discussion, given the development mandate that we must have. But it's essential. You need a strong financial institution that's able to cover its operating costs. And that margin is the right indicator to look at carefully. But it's not the only one. There are certainly others in terms of our capital base, our quality, our asset quality, our earnings potential, and our management of liquidity to make sure that the institution is run as a premier institution. It is able to retain its AAA rating and use that AAA rating to attract additional sources of financing. Exactly. And the last point I'll make on this one is that when it comes to the financial condition of the African Development Bank, it is something that I will do in partnership with other African financial institutions who are already on the continent. The African Import-Export Bank, TDB, Shelter Africa, and many others. We've got to leverage all of our balance sheets to make sure that not only are we financially sustainable, we are growing and dealing with the one thing that we must do on the continent, which is attract as much financing as we can, and make sure that every one of our successful projects is scaling up in a manner that provides impact for our continent.
Fantastic, fantastic. And in my intro, I mentioned, how well regarded you are as a thought leader, especially in the area of African finance. Your publications are quite seminal: Financing Africa, through the crisis and beyond, financial sector development in Africa, and many others, right? How would your intellectual leadership shape AfDB's role in deepening Africa's financial systems, and what areas, should it be paying the most attention to?
In response to that question, I would like to focus on the process that goes into a publication, because that's always the part that I love the most. Okay. Oftentimes, whenever I've gone into a book project or a research project, I'm going into that discussion because I have more questions than I have answers. And the process of collaborating with others and the Making Finance Work for Africa is one of my proudest achievements because of the process we engaged. This was a joint project between the World Bank and the African Development Bank. We found African scholars on the continent who were our peer reviewers. We traveled the continent asking basic questions, pertinent questions. We had seminars where we had experts come in and debate, and the final outcomes and recommendations were instrumental in what we see in Africa today. Payment systems that allow us to make payments across borders easier than was the case before. West African banks in Southern Africa, Southern African banks in East Africa, and the same. But this was the process of publication is what made the process enjoyable. And that's what I would like to make sure is alive and well at the African Development Bank, bringing the culture of debate, making sure that nobody feels uncomfortable questioning something I say simply because I'm the president of the institution, because there is no monopoly of ideas. There's no monopoly of brilliance. And so we must make sure that the chief economist and his entire team are empowered to speak out on controversial issues, even before there's broad-based consensus. Even if it means the president of the African Development Bank has to apologize to a major shareholder, let's have that debate. You cannot grow if you're not debating. And if everything is agreed, then you're not pushing the envelope as much as you can. One practice I have with my current team that I've always enjoyed is that when we're dealing with something that is significant, I always appoint somebody in the team, often the youngest or the youngest professional in there, to criticize and to find faults in everything that I say. And once you have somebody on the team tell the vice president that that idea doesn't make sense, it liberates people, it creates so much energy, and ultimately, of course, as the leader of the team, I will have to make the decision. We may not come to the best solution, but we will find that solution that fits those circumstances as best as we possibly can. And as we walk away from that meeting, I always thank that young professional for challenging me as much as they did, because if that can happen in a senior leadership team meeting, then I know it's going to happen at all ranks within my department. And that's the culture I want to energize within the African Development Bank.
Let it be on record that I've stolen that idea from you, and that I'm going to implement it.
It's fun. It's fun. Trust me, you won't regret it.
No, I love it. I love it. And what we do is, I'll give an opportunity to some of our participants to pose questions, and they're typing up their questions in the Q&A tab. And I'll read out some of them with full attribution. This one is from one of our interns at Nextier, Roslyn, and she insisted that I ask the question verbatim, so I'm going to do that. Her question is, many African countries still rely on concessional financing to fund basic development needs. However, global development finance is shifting, with donors less likely to provide this kind of support. How would you position the AfDB to adapt to this changing landscape while still making sure that low-income and fragile countries get the support they need?
That's an excellent question, because it goes to the heart of the development model that we have today. The development model we have today has reached a point where we all have a sense of permanency of concessional finance. This sense that this is a line item on a country's balance sheet and it will always be there. This is not supposed to be the case. And if you go back in history, you will find that countries like France and Japan, they all used concessional finance, but up until a point where they graduated to regular sources of finance. So it's looking at that graduation process. How can we get more middle income to come to sort of, how can we get more middle income countries in Africa? Now, the important thing is the more countries we get to graduate, the bigger the level and amount of concessional finance that we have on the continent. And so to answer this important question, the first point is to acknowledge that there is no permanency, there's no entitlement to the idea of concessional finance. The second is that development finance as a whole, concessional or otherwise, is not the path for Africa to grow long-term. And we must accelerate the process by which we attract private capital into the development space. So as challenging as the current conversations are that have seen a decline in concessional finance, I genuinely believe that it is a welcome wake-up call for all of us to accelerate everything else around concessional finance. Believe me, I will continue to advocate for concessional finance. I'll continue to fight for it as much as I can because it has a role to play. It allows us to go to market, borrow money, and make it cheaper for our countries, many of whom are still facing significant debt risk. And so that's the approach that I would take.
Fantastic. I have a listener from Zimbabwe, and she referenced one of your recent social media posts where you indicated that you're an amateur artist. And her question is, what is your view on the role the creative industries will play in Africa's renaissance? And what would the Africa Development Bank do to catalyze that economy?
So I love painting. To the extent that I can paint every weekend, I feel I'm much better because painting does something to you that is really important. It allows you to paint on canvas, to make mistakes, to change, to try different things. And it increases your risk appetite in life, in work. You can tolerate mistakes much better because you know you can actually work around it. So I do enjoy painting. The reason I have championed it on this campaign is because we have 7 million kids right now who are graduating from universities without jobs. So I have been on the lookout for industries whose individual projects create many different jobs. If you think about a single film, the number of jobs that come with that film are quite high. If you think about painting, manufacturing canvas, manufacturing paints, exhibitions, events, those jobs are significant. And so if we systematically look for these industries where our young people can have a diversity of jobs from a diversity of backgrounds, then we will accelerate the job creation process. Now, what I'm looking forward to doing with the African Development Bank, first and foremost, is to join those development institutions who are already in this space. The Afri-Exim Bank has been financing a special initiative around the creative arts. The African Development Bank has a program. I want to scale them up. But being a finance person, I also want to take a look at the structure of how we finance the creative arts on the continent, how we can make sure that this is a viable career for someone who is going there. And if you look at how the creative arts have developed everywhere else around the world, this is a business. It's a serious business. And I want to address those structural issues that make sure that as our children are going through university, as they're going through high school, that this is a viable career path for them with a meaningful return.
Exactly. And the questions are piling up. So let me see if I can get through a number of them. There's one from...
I will make my answers shorter so we can.
There's one from Ifoma Ndeku. She said she met you about 10 years ago at University of Manchester when you spoke to Dr. Alitsa's class on structural adjustment programs in Africa in the 80s. And she's seen your videos where you've spoken on the billions of dollars you've raised for the continent, but wants to know how those billions were utilized and if they translated to any form of development for the continent. The second question from her is, how will you ensure that the policies you drive are tailored to address our peculiar African needs and not influenced by the Bretton Woods institutions?
Given that I am at the Bretton Woods Institution, I'd love to make sure that I can still have some positive influence. Look, it's a great question, and thank you for having an alumni on this conversation. I grew up in Zambia during structural adjustment programs, and when I went to the University of Manchester, the University of Manchester is largely a left-leaning university, so it is true that I joined the World Bank, with a healthy dose of skepticism about Bretton Woods institutions as a whole. But one thing that I have benefited from working there all these years is realizing that fundamentally development is about individuals, you and me debating a good outcome. When we have had financing, and this is what I lectured to, like my lecture was on the program, was that at every single phase in time, you will have good intentions going to seek development outcomes. And I'm quite comfortable with the fact that when I look across the continent, those resources have not been wasted. We have seen an increase in a lot of the social indicators on the continent. We have seen cities, the skyline of cities has been growing. We've got governments who know what they need to do. And we're at that phase in life where when I walk into a ministry today, I am meeting colleagues who've been at the same universities I am. It's not a lack of knowledge of what needs to be done. It's a lack of resources. It's a lack of connectivity between the many different operations. And so my answer to my dear sister is, I haven't given up on the development of our continent. I will keep trying different models. I will make sure that those that work are scaled up. Those that don't work, we set them aside. And this brings me to the last point that I will make, that the Bretton Woods institutions are made up of individuals like her and myself and others. The responsibility we all have as Africans on the continent is always to challenge whatever recommendation comes and ask the simple question, does this work for my grandmother in the village? Does this work for my young brothers and sisters who are trying to eke out a living? We must make sure that we own the solutions that are coming out, regardless of where they're coming from, whether it's the Bretton Woods institutions, the African Development Bank, or anywhere else. Let's challenge, let's have the discussion, let's have the debate.
Fantastic. And I like that you mentioned the grandmother in the response to that question, because this one from Olivia Anuno is, from a gender perspective, what bold, disruptive policies will you be championing at the AfDB to transform and drive financial inclusion for women across the continent?
I think the best way we can make sure that a gender inclusive policy is successful is making sure that women are involved in those decisions. It's not for any man, myself, or anybody else to be prescriptive in that regard. But there are some structural things that we can do a lot better. And this is not just about the African Development Bank, it's about society everywhere. If we have a young professionals program, we need to make sure that it's diverse, that it's 50% women and 50% men. When we have a leadership team, it must reflect and make sure that women are at the table and we don't just have special programs that keeps them out of the table. The other thing that I'm very particular about is making sure that we're not just appointing women, but we're taking care of the pipeline. We're looking throughout the institution to make sure that at every level, there's a generation of women and who are accelerating well. In industry, the way we design our programs has to reflect the fact that society is made up of men and women. I'll give you a very simple statistic that in many cases, we all suffer cities with very bad traffic congestion. This is for the simple reason that many of our cities were designed at a time when men went to work, women stayed at home. And so we all have cities that have that one trunk road going to the city center and leaving, and not enough that connect the communities in which we live in, going to the hospital, going to the clinic. We're all suffering for a bad decision that didn't take care of women-led issues. So it may not be disruptive, but certainly the decisions and the focus I will have will be to make sure that we have women at every decision-making table. My mother would expect no less.
I like that. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, but I think it's an important question. He says the speaker is clearly knowledgeable on issues of banking, but that is only one facet of the question. What ails Africa? Or one facet of the question of what ails Africa. I hear nothing. He hasn't spoken on the geopolitics of the problems of Africa. How does he plan to deal with this elephant in the room?
It's a mighty big elephant. One of the things that I've learned in my time in development is that development is a political process. Any institution, any development institution that says we are apolitical, not involved in politics, is not living in the reality of the world that we live in today. But I'm also mindful that for an effective institution, you do need to be disciplined about your mandate. Otherwise, you will get bogged down in way too many issues. As part of my campaign, it was therefore important for me to go and congratulate the new AU chair, because I firmly believe that the African Union and the African Development Bank are two sides of the same coin. He and I, should I be successful in this campaign, will spend a lot of time together, working and addressing the development of our continent, both from a political and economic perspective. We are losing too many cities to fragile situations, and every single time we have a fragile country like Sudan and what it's going through today, every neighboring country catches a cold. It holds back our development in neighboring countries. It increases the cost of capital that is coming into the continent, regardless of where you currently are. So Kenya pays a higher premium because there's conflict in Sudan. Zambia pays a higher premium because the Sahel is unsteady, because people see Africa as one country. And so the question that has been raised is really fundamental. It's important. I fully recognize, and I think in the brevity of a conversation like this one,
Yeah.
I wouldn't possibly cover all of my angles. And so, but I welcome the question because it does give me the opportunity to reaffirm my firm conviction that development is a political process. We have a lot of issues on our own continent that we must address from a political cycle. And I'll give you a simple example. I think there are some sectors today that are struggling. For example, we've seen the withdrawal of concessional financing in health. Health, education are things that must be decided on by governments, making sure that we protect that development finance from the changing winds of our development model. So development and politics, same conversation, but that's one that I will partner with governments and the African Union to make sure that it's addressed correctly.
Exactly. This question is from Wisdom Utin, and we kind of touched on it previously, but maybe it's just to go a little bit deeper. How is the AfDB promoting the development of financial infrastructure and services to facilitate seamless intra-Africa trade, with a particular focus on overcoming the challenges of cross-border payments within the continent? Why does it remain more cost-effective and operationally efficient to transfer funds from countries such as the UK to African nations than between African states themselves? What specific initiatives or partnerships is the AfDB undertaking to address these structural inefficiencies, or does this issue lie beyond the scope of the bank's current priorities?
Thank you for that question. It speaks to the infrastructure challenges that we have on the continent. When I talk about making continental free trade work on the continent, it's physical infrastructure, it's financial infrastructure, it's human infrastructure. There's so many issues that we all need to address. And I want to acknowledge the questioner's question that we still have a lot more to do in making sure that transfers of financing are working well. I'm not yet at the African Development Bank, so I won't speak to what they're currently doing. But I know from my work at the World Bank, but this is an area that we have partnered with the African Development Bank, that we work closely. And the work takes place at 3 different levels. Number one, at a political level, given our last question, working with governments to understand that financial connectivity is essential to their individual and collective growth. Secondly, physically making the investments in the infrastructure that allows financial institutions to transact with one another. And that investment includes regulations to make sure that there is faith and trust in financial movements on the continent. Third, making sure that the financial institutions participating in these transactions see the broader value that they're making to real economic growth. And I'll also add that at the end of the day, it's users such as yourselves, it's private firms themselves, making sure that whenever we see these barriers to trade, we highlight them. And part of the role of the African Development Bank is actually not just the financing, it's also the knowledge, making sure that we're identifying and we're researching and we're talking about these issues. And so feedback like the one you've provided allows us to tap into specific markets and then address them as needed. So thank you for that question.
So I have 2 questions, that are kind of related. So let me see if I can combine them. One is from Vipia Mango, and sorry if I messed up the name. And the second is from Emmanuel Aduku. So it's really around, how to enhance trade and value addition within the African continent so as to trigger economic growth, and the role the AfDB could play with regional, supranational institutions and national governments to develop these regional value chains, tied to critical raw materials. So it's all around that intra-trade, but creating the value chains and creating opportunities for value addition. Over.
No, thank you very much for that question. One of the things that I hope we can move to is an environment where we're not just talking about trade in conferences and events and sort of championing the benefits of trade, but actually spending time working towards it and getting to the plumbing work that needs to be done. In order for us to increase continental trade, we have to start early in the process. We have to make sure that within our own countries, we're promoting domestic private enterprise. If Ghanaians are not buying Ghanaian products, why should a Zambian buy them, right? And so you must invest in your own economies. And the other thing is, you're not just doing it because you feel good about it, but trade is a muscle that an enterprise needs to develop with time. When you're buying from these products, you're giving the opportunity to expand their markets. When we're buying from our neighboring countries, you're developing that export muscle, that trading muscle that all enterprises need to have. The second is trade is not just about the borders that exist between ourselves. It also speaks to how industries within governments, within countries, negotiate with one another. It shouldn't be that we have 5 delegations from 5 African countries going to one European country or Asian country to negotiate agreements. We need all 5 presenting and negotiating together. We need to do the same thing and increase the number of trade visits amongst ourselves. It shouldn't always that we're traveling to China or the US or Europe. We should have Southern African countries going to North African countries and vice versa. So that human interaction is critical. It also means that we have to tackle things such as our aviation industry, making it easier to travel across the continent, visa requirements.
Tell me about
so
it.
I'm sure. But that's the level of detail we need to get to. And we need an African Development Bank that speaks to those plumbing issues, that is not shy about having the political conversation that we need these things to be worked on. And I'll be the first one to admit that we may not always be able to get these things done. There are many valid reasons why they haven't been fixed. But we need to have that honest conversation so that we're not hitting our heads against the wall. We're not consistently preaching about things that we've decided are not going to work. We need to find workarounds. So in my summary response to your question is that in order for us to get trade moving, we need to work one layer below, get to the plumbing, go country by country, go border by border, get the initiatives going that we need to get done. That's where trade takes place. It's at the individual firm level, it's at the individual country level. But we need to accelerate that process so that we're not duplicating all these efforts, we're doing it en masse.
This question is from Zainab Dati, and it's again on the intra-Africa trade. You cannot trade if you cannot transport. You cannot connect digitally if fiber stops at the border. We need to prioritize Pan-African roads, rail, ports, grids, and internet infrastructure. We have to think in corridors, not just countries. The AfDB has led in funding large-scale infrastructure and now supports industrialization and regional trade under the AfCFTA. But what will it take for the bank to move from backing projects to backing cross-border production ecosystems? For instance, can the AfDB create special industrial corridors where it co-invests with countries and private sector players to build shared value chains in sectors like agro processing, green manufacturing, and may I even add, electricity infrastructure? Over.
I love that question. I love the analysis and the options. On the analysis, it's absolutely true. All of our goods that we produce on the continent are either rotting or they are more expensive. Transport costs add as much as 40% of our production costs. Our port infrastructure needs work. So some of our goods are spending 30 days in port before they're cleared. So fixing our infrastructure is absolutely the right thing. I love the fact that you pointed out digital infrastructure. when you are trading on the continent, the speed at which information moves from one country to the other is absolutely essential. I'll give you a very simple example. When you and I are traveling from one city, making 3 different connections to a final destination, when you check in, your information and your baggage leave at the same time as you do. When you arrive at your final destination, you haven't checked in 4 times. You will arrive and find your bag there. And yet, our poor truck drivers arrive at a border post, get out of the car, fill in a form, get back into their truck, cross the bridge, get out of the car, fill in the same type of forms, and they will do that 5 times before they get to their destination. All because the information that they could have sent further ahead digitally doesn't have the infrastructure that currently allows us to do that. Which is why I would say yes to all of the recommendations that I hear in the question. With the limited resources that we have as an institution, it is imperative that when we're investing in infrastructure, we're doing it with a corridor model, because we won't have the luxury to keep coming back to these projects. The corridor model is also addresses a fundamental challenge we have on the continent, which is maintenance of the infrastructure we built. If you build a road and you build a corridor where private firms are coming in and paying taxes, the council or the governments have the resources to maintain those roads. When we don't have a corridor, 5 years, if we are lucky, otherwise 2 years from then, the road needs maintenance. We're out with a begging bowl, asking for donor financing to fix a critical trunk infrastructure. We may not be able to do that for all of our roads, but certainly those trunk infrastructure that connect our major cities, be they Nairobi, Cairo, Abidjan, Cape Town, we need to make sure that that model that the questioner rightly asked is one that we take seriously going forward.
Exactly. And maybe one more question from her. I think we've got enough time to take that. Again, it's still from Zainab Dati. And she says, Dr. Sam, we've had strong commitment from the AfDB on regional integration, AfCFTA, and industrialization. But many young African entrepreneurs, especially women, still feel shut out, either because of financing bottlenecks, regulatory red tape, or because the big ticket infrastructure projects rarely trickle down. How do you see the AfDB pushing member states, not just to build roads and railways, but to build inclusive economies? Can we expect the bank to attach political conditions or incentives to ensure that the infrastructure it finances actually leads to jobs, trade access, and capital for women and youth-led enterprises across borders, not just for the big firms?
That's an excellent question. And one thing that I will stress right from the bat is that unless our development is inclusive, then we have no business being in development. And the point that you have raised, Zainab, is one that I have consistently heard across the campaign trail when I've met young entrepreneurs who are doing amazing things. People often ask me where I see the source of growth. Is it in China? Is it in the US? Or is it in Europe? And I say to them, the largest source of growth on the continent is from young people who have gone outside the continent, who are coming back, who are investing. And I think it's important that we address these issues. The honest truth is that this is a challenging area, and therefore the one initiative that I intend to implement at the African Development Bank very early in my presidency is having a youth council, having young people have direct access to the president and the leadership team, and having them use their network to make sure that whenever we're designing operations, the youth voice is there. The second thing I'm tired of is going around the continent, meeting amazing young people, and then ending up in conferences where the average age is way, way above what our continent looks like. I think we need to spend more time giving our young people the space that they need to do things that they do best and getting out of the way as often as we can. And then fundamentally, it's also making sure we're designing our infrastructure in ways that accommodates young people who don't have capital. I'm excited whenever I go to a city and I find a government has invested in public space for people like WeWork structures where people can go in, rent space for a desk in order to establish their businesses. When I've traveled the world, the last time I was in Mexico, I was amazed at how, the city councils give young budding entrepreneurs free space for a year until their ideas mature. We need to invest in those type of infrastructures to make sure that we are supporting our young people. And so as a last question, I am very happy that we ended up talking about our young people. I continue to be amazed at the work that they're doing in sophisticated sectors and industries. They have a boldness, they have a sense of urgency. They don't have the patience that my generation had in waiting for the future. The future is really here. And Zainab's question is well phrased, and it's one that I want to come back to with a group of young people to make sure we're designing our financial instruments, we're designing our programs in a way that works for young people. I am reluctant to talk about conditions and requirements, because if you have to force a government to do the right thing, then you will exert your energies enforcing those conditions rather than supporting the very people you want to spend time with. When I come to a country, hopefully as president, I don't want to spend time looking at which conditions have been met or not. I want to be in the field with young people like Zainab and others, seeing what they're doing and how we can support them more.
No, this has been fantastic, and we've kind of really run out of time, but I want to give you like a minute, to talk to Africans, something we haven't covered or something that's top of mind for you, just 1 minute, and then we can bring it to a close.
One thing is this race has lasted 9 months. When I started, I was clear-eyed about the challenges that we face. And certainly traveling across the continent, I've seen the best of what Africa can be. I've seen the challenges of people struggling with basic things. And I conclude this race more inspired by our potential, more confident in our future, and ready to roll up my sleeves to work from day one with young people, working with people who are in government today, many of whom know what needs to be done. So I'm excited about the prospects. I certainly hope that the election next week goes my way. But even if it doesn't, the important thing is that Africa's future is bright, and I will continue to be a part of it in whatever capacity this turns out to be. Thank you very much for your time, Patrick.
Dr.
And I hope
Maimbo,
we can catch up after the election and continue this conversation.
Fantastic. And thank you for making time for us today. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today's episode of Development Discourse. Big ideas, hard questions, real conversations. Until next time, I'm Patrick Okigbo. Let's keep building that society that we want to live in. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you very much. Take care.